Well, good afternoon and welcome. As the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston presents our program on ongoing threats of chemical weaponry in and around Syria. I want to make sure all of you got our new March 2022 calendars. We're going to try to keep those updated for you about every month. And if you're here in the room or you're joining us online, just make sure you visit our website often because we're always adding new programs. So do you have a March 2022 calendar? I think you're caught up. And if you don't, then make sure you visit our website. We have some amazing programs coming up, such as next week, we are going to be hosting Rob Mossbacher. He's going to be discussing business in the developing world. Then on March 10th, mark your calendars for an evening program out of the Westin with Ambassador Carlos Vecchio from Venezuela, or on Venezuela. Then on March 15th, we have a program on the conflicts in Ethiopia. And as well, later in March, we have our conversation with Ambassador William Taylor, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Sure, I'll have a few things to mention to us. So make sure you register for all of those. We'd love to see you, and we're so glad you could join us tonight. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our great board member from Schlumberger, and please join me in welcoming Nick Tran. He is one of our board members.
I'm Nick Tran with Schlumberger. A little bit about me, I'm a combat vet. Came over here from Vietnam as a refugee, and then seeing how Americans came and fought for our country. I wanted to pay back this country, and after high school, I was in the Army. I ended up fighting in Desert Storm, which is pretty interesting. I get to introduce Joby Warrick. And when we invaded Kuwait, we invaded with the threat of Saddam potentially using chemical weapons on us. So we went into Iraq with chemical suits into Iraq. And then later on, I fought in Afghanistan, and then going back to Iraq in 2010. And what I do now with Schlumberger is I lead our global veteran initiative to help empower veterans, either bring them to the workforce or at least help them with recovery from PTS, homelessness, or just get them back, reintegrated back to society. The other thing I do is also community affairs work to make sure that where we live and work, we're able to empower the community. So it is my honor to introduce Joby Warrick and read a little bit of the bio about Joby. Joby's been a reporter for the Washington Post since 1996. He served with the Post Investigative and National Security teams, currently writes about the Middle East, terrorism, weapons proliferation. He's also the author of 3 nonfiction books, including the 2021 Red Line, The Unraveling of Syria, America's Race to Destroy the Most Dangerous Arsenal in the World. The second book, Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS, which was awarded the 2016 Pulitzer Prize nonfiction. His first book, Triple Agent, recounts the 2009 suicide attacks by Al-Qaeda informant on a CIA base in Khost, Afghanistan, that killed 9 intelligence operatives. Before joining the Post, Warrick covered the fall of communism in Eastern Europe as a UPI correspondent and worked as a reporter for the Delaware County Daily Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the News and Observer of Raleigh, North Carolina. While in Raleigh, he co-authored Boss Hog, a series of investigative stories that documented political and environmental fallout caused by the factory farming in the Southeast. The series won the 1996 Pulitzer Prize Gold Medal for public service. Please put your hands together and welcome Joby Warrick.
Thank you all for joining us, especially all of you joining us at home. And thank you all for coming out. An important topic, short subject, and a special thanks to Nick Tran, a great member of the council, a board member, especially for your service. Like you're saying, to have gone back into the military, some of our toughest times, the first Gulf War, and go back. After 9/11, we're truly grateful for what you've done and what you continue to do now with veterans with Schlumberger. And I want to say I'm truly honored to host Joby Warrick. I've got to know his work. I read Triple Agent when it first came out, a fascinating book. Black Flags, his book on ISIS, as all you may know, won the Pulitzer Prize. Incredible book. And tonight I just thought it's obviously directly related to Syria, directly related to what we're talking about in this book. But I just thought, I'd open to really whatever way you want to think about it, to extend your thoughts and your hopes to the people of Ukraine, for what they're facing, what they're going through now, and what they're looking forward to in the next few weeks and months and perhaps years is pretty awful. And perhaps similarly so, I would say I'd also feel for the average Russian citizen living under a regime led by a calculating thug, basically. So we will get into the book itself and then kind of bring it forward to where we are today with regards to the Middle East with terrorism. But could you maybe talk about the kind of unfortunate irony that in 2015, the Russians went in massively in large way to support Assad. A lot of the combat, aircraft that are flying now over Ukraine or will be flying soon are pilots that cut their teeth in Syria, bombing especially the rebel groups. The special forces groups that are active in Syria, similarly so, are going to be active, and they're already active in Ukraine. And the Russian, paramilitary and mercenary groups like the Wagner Group, obviously, are very active in Syria. What do you see as the kind of most notable kind of concerning connection between Syria, Russia, and Ukraine, sadly, today?
Well, thanks again. Thank you so much for moderating this. Thanks for everybody coming out. Such a terrible night. Believe it or not, it was warmer in DC when I left. It was in the 60s, and I come here to the North Pole. So thanks for that. But yeah, it's been striking. Someone who's spent so much time and paid so much attention to Syria in the last few years, and to see what's happening in Ukraine, and to see how, in so many ways, Putin set up what he's doing now with the experience that he and his military had in Syria. Here was a place that they had several objectives. They wanted to prop up their good friend Bashar al-Assad, who's the only warm water port for the Russians in the world is in Syria. They got many reasons for wanting to maintain their relations with that country and keep a friendly leader in power. But for Russia, it really became an opportunity to stretch their legs militarily and do some things they'd never done before. This was the first major military excursion since Afghanistan for the Russians, if you don't count the things that happened in the old Soviet territory, in Georgia, places like that, in Crimea. But here was the place for them to try out military doctrine, to try out new weapon systems. They tried more than 100 new weapon systems in Syria, and an entire generation of junior officers cycled through Syria at some point and got their combat experience. So the things they're doing now, the use of air power, the use of drones, surgical strikes, those are the kinds of things they really mastered in Syria. But the interesting thing on the other side, the thing that was so impressive, if you can use that word about Syria in their operation there, was this doctrine of limited involvement, limited action. So they didn't invest very heavily, for example, boots on the ground. There weren't many Russian soldiers there ever. It was mostly a support role. It was essentially an air power and support training mission that they were doing. And they did it deliberately to limit the costs in treasury and also blood. They didn't lose many soldiers there at all. And here they're taking such a sort of the opposite tack. They take a very big, very risky operation in Ukraine, which they certainly have the forces to prevail, but it's going to be expensive for them in many ways. And they're going to end up occupying a country that doesn't want them there. And I've spent some time in Ukraine. I know how a lot of Ukrainians feel about the Russians. They're not rolling out the welcome mat. So it's going to be a kind of a tough slog for them, I think.
And we'll get into your red line, and then all of you watching at home, we're mailing you a copy, so don't worry, you're going to get it. And I'm going to get Joby to sign you a copy afterwards. All of you in the audience, please get your book signed afterwards as well. For those of you who have read it, Black Flag is really perhaps the seminal account and of the rise of ISIS, what ISIS means. In a lot of ways, as an international bestseller, and probably, in fairness, it's the way probably a large number of Americans came to really understand the realities of ISIS. This book here, Redline, and we'll get into it. I don't want to cover too much of the book, because you guys can read it. It's a true story, but Joby's an incredible writer, writes it as like a thriller. But at its core, what would you like people to take away from this book? What are the most important elements you'd like them to take away from it before we get into kind of some of the actual details of it?
Well, there's a lot that I try to do in the book, including explaining why we got involved to the extent we did in Syria. We didn't. Do we need to let some folks spend it through something? But there's actually a good news story. So much of what comes out of this part of the world is so gloomy and so depressing, but I promise you there's a story that's going to make you proud that you're American that's contained within this volume. And what it is there was, in addition to the sort of horrors of this awful chemical weapons attack that took place in 2013 that we all saw and witnessed and were shocked by, something really amazing happened after that. After the deal was struck, and we can talk about this a bit later, to get the weapons out, somebody had to go into Syria in the middle of the civil war with fighting going on all sides and extract 1,300 tons of some of the most dangerous chemicals that have ever been made by man, nerve agents, VX, sarin, and haul it out to a port to be taken out to sea. And then we had to figure out how to destroy it. Because no country in the world was willing to take the chemicals. So what mayor was going to say, oh, bring that sarin to Houston or Port MacArthur or Arthur, we'll handle the. Nobody, the Russians didn't want it, nobody wanted it. So we had to innovate a way to destroy those weapons, and we do it in a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean. And how that happens is a story that just about nobody heard at the time because it happened fairly quietly, and it was just a kind of a flash in the news, and if you blinked, you missed it. But it was an extraordinary moment of American ingenuity to deal with a problem that nobody else could do. So it's still the case. There are things that America can do that nobody else can do. We have the resources, we have the skill, the talent in-house, and when the political will exists to make something happen, we can make things happen. We didn't solve the bigger conflict, the bigger problem in Syria persists, and is still very, very dangerous. But we did some things right, and we just didn't get a lot of credit for it.
And just to move on to a kind of a basic question, I think anybody would ask at the time, or anyone kind of approaching the book now, most people would say, why in the world would Assad decided to repeatedly use chemical weapons, but militarily speaking, conventional bombing or artillery is going to be probably much more effective. And was it to cause psychological terror amongst the civilian population? Was it to kind of just instill that complete fear in large parts of the population to clear out areas? Why would he take such a huge gamble and repeatedly use chemical weapons?
Interesting question. So the thing you have to understand about this chemical arsenal that Syria had, it was meant to be a strategic weapon. So basically, Israel next door has nuclear weapons, Syria doesn't. So they decided instead to create their own WD, which is chemical weapons. So not nearly as good, of course, but you could put sarin in a Scud missile and send it to Tel Aviv, and you kill thousands of people. So they saw it as their deterrent weapon, and that's why they made it. And the entire system was set up to essentially use against Israel. But you have to remember about Assad. In 2012, 2013, he is a desperate man. He's worried about losing his regime, about losing his life, and he's a brutal man. I remember talking to a diplomat who was speaking with some of his deputies at the time, trying to convince him that you have to make concessions to these pro-democracy demonstrators. You can't kill your way out of this problem. And the reply was, we were built for this. You don't know, there's no bottom to the brutality that we're willing to stoop to. And so we're going to, if we have to destroy the country, we'll destroy this rebellion. So that brutality, that willingness to kill people through any means available, including with chemical weapons, was always on the table for them. The problem was, can they get away with it? And so you see them in 2013 repurpose this strategic weapons program from being in Scud missiles to being in small delivery systems, tear gas canisters, rocket shells, mortar shells, and use it to break the back, to break the morale of people who are trying to defeat the regime. And that's what they did. And they did it in 2012 and 2013 about 6 or 8 times. Very, very small attacks. One person killed, maybe 2 or 3 in another incident, just to try out the theory to see if it would work, see what the reaction would be. And there wasn't much reaction, so they did the big one, miscalculated, I think, in 2013. They dropped some artillery rockets in some residential neighborhoods near Damascus that were opposition strongholds, maybe not calculating that sarin being heavier than air seeped down into basements where families were staying. They essentially being used as bomb shelters. And that's why you have this massive number of casualties, very densely populated areas, people living in basements, and an overnight, middle of the night sarin attack just wiped out entire neighborhoods. And we think about 1,400 people were killed. It was the deadliest single day in the entire 11-year conflict caused by one attack involving sarin. And so they had a powerful weapon and they were brutal enough to use it, I guess is the bottom line.
And on the flip side of it, what obviously made things very difficult for Obama and then obviously for Trump and now even for Biden, trying to figure out where Syria goes from here. Obviously, it doesn't look great. The one huge concern was Assad is a butcher, he is awful, but perhaps what's worse is if ISIS or Al-Qaeda comes to power, or perhaps are they going to be able to capture some weapons if the Syrian military gets too weak or they overrun a certain station. You detail it, wonderfully in the book. Maybe you could talk about how incredibly close it came. There where you talk about chemical weapons facility being overrun by the Islamic Front. How close were terrorist groups to actually getting sarin gas, to getting some of these weapons?
The thing that was sort of freaking out the CIA at the time, this is 2012 timeframe, a little bit later, was the fact that we knew, and I explained this in the book, that we actually had a spy inside Syria's chemical weapons program, a very good one of their top scientists who worked for us for years. So we understood that program very well. We knew where it was located, and we knew that these weapons were scattered across the country. There were a lot of them around Homs, a major city, some around Damascus, a few up near Aleppo, but they were scattered and they were in areas where there was fighting going on. And the thing is about chemical weapons compared to a sort of nuclear or biological weapon, they're portable. They're essentially, a lot of this stuff is sitting in liquid form in vats. You can roll one of those vats into a truck and you've got yourself, a few hundred gallons of some really horrible stuff. The way that the Syrians kept it, it was actually in binary form, meaning that it's a peanut butter and jelly situation. You got your peanut butter, you just need to add the jelly and you got your thing. But the only ingredient you had to add was alcohol, isopropyl alcohol. It's just one essential ingredient you had to add. So anybody with some chemical know-how could have turned a big vat of sarin into a very powerful terrorism weapon. And the fear for the White House at the time was if even a few liters of this stuff gets out, it gets used in a terrorist attack in London or Paris or somewhere in the States, it's a history-changing event. It's a 9/11 scale event, and it's something that will probably force America to go to war, or the Europeans, or whoever was involved in the attack. It's the war we desperately wanted to stay out of. And so we just really were very anxious to make sure that nobody stole these weapons. The problem is, as the fighting continued, the rebel armies and some really bad groups, some of the extremists, were getting very, very, very close to where these things were kept. In one instance, they overran a facility. They apparently didn't know what was there. They didn't take anything. Syrians apparently evacuated some of the material before the attack took place. And then near the end of the mission that I described in the book, there's one last repository that's out in the western desert, west of Damascus. And it's completely surrounded by this Islamist army. And we know they want the stuff. I mean, they said that fairly publicly. We'd love to get our hands on this. And it was just miraculous that it didn't happen. And I think in more time, I think the opportunity might have come for these guys to steal something pretty terrible, and we would have heard about it.
And just for people to grasp the reality of the threat, ISIS on their own, I mean, you talk about developing their own weapons, chlorine gas and other agents have used chemical weapons against Iraqi civilians, Iraqi military at least 70 times. You talk about what ISIS has done and perhaps what they are still looking to do.
Yeah. So ISIS comes along in the war a little too late to steal the weapons themselves. So they really start to become powerful in 2013. And by late 2013, the sarin is moving out, so they missed their chance. And so they decided instead to take Assad's example and make their own. And so after they were able to take control of Mosul, a very serious, dedicated chemical weapons program started up, run by the Islamic State, where they had scientists they recruited from Saddam Hussein's former program. They had European scientists who came in to help them. So it's a very sophisticated program, and they succeeded in creating sulfur mustard, which is mustard gas. We remember that from World War I. It's awful stuff. It's not as bad as a nerve agent like sarin, but it's the first time, with the possible exception of this Japanese cult called Refugee, that a terrorist group has had the capacity to essentially manufacture a chemical weapon. And they had just gotten started, they were beginning to refine the process when they lost control of Mosul, and that's kind of the end of it. But you have to understand that that know-how exists, it resides somewhere within the collective memory of this organization. If they have a chance to do something like that again, I think there's little question they would do it, because they've always said publicly, Osama bin Laden himself said, weapons of mass destruction, obtaining them is a religious duty for us. This is not something they take as just, well, it'd be nice if we got it. They're dedicated in the sense of wanting to do it, because that would be the ultimate terrorist attack, is to use WMD of some kind.
And, you know, it's the title of the book. It's what most Americans are probably most familiar with. Obama, perhaps it was off the cuff. I'm sure he very infuriated by his national security team when he said it. But he declares his red line. I don't want to give too much away. You guys can read the book and you might remember something. But can you talk about how Obama went from an expected, you know, large-scale aerial assault, probably cruise missiles and whatnot, to holding off, and how we eventually got to this negotiated agreement with the Russians?
Yeah. What I will say, because it's very complicated, and I do encourage, if you read the book, you'll see this is a wrenching decision, and there are many reasons for that. One is there aren't really very many good options when it comes to chemical weapons. The real concern for the national security folks was not just to retaliate against the crossing of a red line, but figure out a way to get rid of these dangerous weapons. But you can't drop a bomb on them. If you drop a bomb on a bunker full of sarin, you're not going to destroy it all, you're going to spread it. Some of it's going to end up escaping, volatilizing. You got a poison plume that drifts off to a nearby town, and suddenly you killed, you know, scores, maybe more of these women and children that you would hope to save. So that's a bad offshoot. You can't send in the 101st Airborne and try to take the weapons out, because they're scattered and there's a war going on. The Pentagon did a study and figured out, in order to get in there, get the weapons and get out again safely, it would take about 70,000 troops. So that wasn't going to happen either. So the only thing you're left with is essentially a punitive strike, you know, looking tough. We're enforcing our red line, and there's value in that for sure. But in terms of practical effect, it doesn't get you very far, because we actually saw the same thing play out in 2017 when President Trump ordered a strike. And the result was we knocked out an airfield, destroyed some planes. The airfield was up and running again the next day, and the planes were using it to bomb Syrian villages. So the deterrent effect was pretty limited. And so that's why these were very complicated choices. So it came down to, well, do we look weak and not strike, versus, well, here's an opportunity, maybe, we'll test the Russians on this, but can we potentially eliminate the entire stockpile, which nobody thought was even remotely possible until suddenly Russians came by and said, hey, we can make Assad unilaterally give up his most important, most secret strategic arsenal, and we can force him to do it if you delay your strike. And that was the bet that we eventually took. And pluses and minuses on what actually happened, but it is a fact that we did manage to get rid of about 90% of the stockpile, and not just the weapons, but the teams went in and destroyed their factories and the production centers, all their equipment, none of which, as far as we can tell, has ever been rebuilt. So we essentially gutted their program in 9 months during the middle of the war, which is pretty remarkable.
And your book highlights, I have to say something myself, and talk about the incredible courage and bravery of a lot of these weapons inspectors from the UN, from other organizations, to basically go into full-fledged combat situations, deal with being shot at by both side forces potentially, and rebel forces, jihadist forces. And then once you get to your job site, you're dealing with some of the most deadly chemicals in the world. Maybe just highlight one or two of those individuals that you really kind of bring to life in the book.
So my favorite is a guy named Åke Sällström. He's a Swedish medical professor. I guess he was probably in his early 60s at the time. These guys were in Syria to try to investigate allegations of chemical weapons use, small attacks I refer to. While he's there, in the middle of the night, there's an attack that goes on in the distant suburbs, and he actually, some of his team, they're woken up by the sort of the flashes and the noise of it. And this was the night that this chemical weapons attack takes place. And so they get up in the morning and they're turning on CNN in their hotel, and there's this carnage in the suburbs of Damascus. he's there to investigate these allegations. So we insist, well, we gotta go, we gotta see what happened, we gotta collect evidence, we gotta do our job. And this guy he's a pacifist actually. He got exempted from military service in Sweden because he's opposed to war. So it's not like he's no Bruce Willis. And they're not armed. They have on, armored jackets and helmets just for their own protection. But these guys, they're unescorted, they get in their little UN vehicles and they insist on going to the scene of the attack to collect evidence. They have to cross no man's land, so if you go from Syrian control to opposition control, thinking or hoping that there was somebody on the other side who was going to meet them. They didn't really know the person, they didn't know what was going to happen. They start driving down this road to cross no man's land, and all of a sudden, a sniper starts shooting out the convoy. It's like, rockets, bullets pinging off their vehicles. These are armored cars, thank goodness, but the way armored cars work is they'll take some fire, but after a while, particularly the windows, if they get hit enough times, the glass basically explodes and you don't have an armored vehicle anymore. So they turn around and they say, oh crap, we're getting shot at. So they went back to their meeting point and to regroup and to think about what to do. And they're thinking, well, we're kind of done here, we're just too dangerous. But Selstrom says, no, if we go back now, it means the Syrians will know that they can intimidate us and we'll never be able to do this job. So we're gonna go back and we're gonna go down a road where the only thing we know for sure is there's a sniper there waiting for us. And so they all lined up their convoy, they took their armored jackets and put them like on the windows and used their legs to kind of prop them up to make sure they didn't fall down. And they just hightailed it across no man's land as fast as they could go and successfully made it to the other side. They get there, they get held up at gunpoint by some extremists. They come to this awful scene where just these field hospitals inside people's houses and basements where people are dead and dying from exposure to these chemical weapons. And they do their job. They collect evidence, they collect tissue samples and blood samples and pieces of the shells that fell. They're able to trace they can actually tell the trajectories of the shells, so they can tell where they came from. Gathered all this really great evidence, and then went back to Syria, back to Damascus rather, to be able to take it back home so they can analyze the stuff. And they were so afraid that because they knew these Syrians knew they had all this evidence in their hotel rooms. And so they essentially decided to hide the evidence in different rooms and stick it in the cubbies here and there, hoping that if the Syrians broke in the middle of the night, they would steal everything. They might get some of it, but not all of it. But this is the kind of stuff, these are, we deride the UN sometimes as being this bloated, dysfunctional agency. Here's a bunch of guys making not a lot of money with no military training and taking on a risk that is hard for us to even imagine. And they did it because they thought there was some good to be done if we could get this evidence and show the world what Assad had done, and that's what they see what they're doing.
With regard to Obama and his red line, and it was eventually paying to, most people would argue, a very good, fortunate resolution that you eliminate 90% of their weapons when airstrikes would have reduced a tiny fraction of it. But is there a bigger consequence to it? Maybe in two regards. One, in that Obama declared this red line about the use of chemical weapons, inferring to the world that the US will strike back. Did we lose credibility there? And then also when he decided to not make this decision unilaterally, that he was going to put it before Congress, did he take away some of the inherent authority of American presidents in the future as commander-in-chief to have the ability to quickly and decisively use military force?
Yeah, these are good questions. And there was a cost to the president for deciding not to strike. And you can argue about whether or not as sort of the ultimate goal or ultimate gain was bigger, but there was this moment where the credibility of the US is questioned. And not just by political critics of the president here in this country, but some of our allies. The French were ready to strike, and they were upset with us for not doing it. Some of our Arab allies thought this looked weak, and we weren't sort of backing up our promises. So there was a consequence for that, and maybe we can get to this later. But the bigger price really was from folks within the opposition movement and the Syrian side, who really expected this was the moment that finally America's going to get involved in their war, and the tide will turn. They're going to get rid of Assad. And when we didn't do it, there was this massive sense of betrayal, of feeling that America had let them down. And you see, even to this day, when I talk to people there who lived through that moment, they felt betrayed by that decision. They're still angry about it. And some of them will talk about how it was a moment where they just felt that, well, this is hopeless. The West is never going to come through it all. We're going to have to figure out a way to defeat Assad ourselves. And the only way to do that is to line up with the guys with the guns and the know-how, that means the militants, the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda people. And so some of those Syrian fighters ended up switching sides and joining some of the bad guys because they just felt America's not coming to our aid, so we have to fight the best we can.
Just for where the Obama administration got to, Trump administration got to, Biden administration got to, is it just kind of the cruel reality that Assad is basically the worst butcher of this century so far? But that all three presidents made the decision that it's better to deal with the devil we know than the devil we don't, that if he topples, we have Islamists come to power, we have Al-Qaeda come to power, we have ISIS come to power. Is that just the Faustian bargain that they all kind of settled on?
You know, I had this amazing conversation with a diplomat who was doing reporting for this book, and he said, you know, look at what we've tried to do over the last few years and how futile our efforts have been in every case. In Iraq, we went in guns blazing. What happened? Was that a good experience? No, things kind of fell apart. We had a pretty rough ride in Iraq. And Libya, we decided, well, let's do this middle thing. We have a no-fly zone. We'll use our air power to help the opposition defeat a dictator, and Gaddafi is killed. What a mess Libya is today. And in Syria, we essentially stayed out of it. And that's equally horrific as the outcome there. So no matter what we do, we just sort of a lesson in humility that it's almost beyond our ability, and it is beyond our ability, frankly, to solve some of these problems. And so sometimes it is the realistic deal, the practical deal that kind of is the smart thing to do. In hindsight, a lot of the guys who were around Obama at the time, their sense is the biggest mistake they made was not the red line statement. It was an earlier one made by our government, by Obama himself, but also by our European allies, saying in 2011 that Assad must go. So they all kind of got up almost in lockstep. You know, the Egyptian president had fallen, Gaddafi had fallen, so all these Arab Spring revolutions were happening, and bad dictators were falling left and right. And so it was this moral moment where America had to stand up and say, Assad, you've betrayed your people, you're not fit to be leader, and you must go. And that was a nice kind of a very moralistic thing to say. It's sort of putting us on the side of people aspiring for democracy. But what it did actually was to convince a lot of people in Syria that America was going to help them win. And a lot of our allies in Gulf states thought, okay, well, America's coming in now, the Qataris, the Saudis, the Emiratis, let's throw some money and weapons into this and get our own little militias funded. And so a lot of people jumped into the conflict because they really thought that well, this is how it's going to work. America's going to make sure that Assad leaves, and so we got to get part of the action. And what that ended up doing was pumping unbelievable amounts of weapons and ammunition and foreign fighters, and just essentially more and more and more gasoline on the fire until this thing became massive. And what ISIS had something like 30,000 foreign fighters who came from other countries to join in the fight. It became this big international thing and a cause to be a part of. And it was essentially, a lot of it started from this just declaration, Assad must go, so he's going to go.
And just looking at where we are with Syria now, you note in the book, since all of that, they've used chemical weapons multiple times since then. They've reconstituted some of their programs. So that's obviously still a threat. Just looking at an even more frightening picture, do you think there's any chance they would reconstitute a nuclear program? In 2007, the Israelis bombed their plutonium reactor, and if they did re-engage a program like that, would you expect the Israelis to strike again?
I have to tell you that I spend a fair amount of time talking to intelligence folks in my business, and it's a real interesting conversation always. And so it's a special privilege to be able to talk to guys like that. And they've all been struck by Israel's ability to penetrate Syria, and it seems to be almost without limit, and it's quite good. A few weeks ago, I had a story about a Syrian effort to import some chemicals that can be used to make nerve agents. It was the first real hard evidence of an effort to reconstitute the program. They hadn't restarted anything, they didn't have a factory going, they just imported the precursor chemicals. And suddenly one night, some Israeli missiles hit these houses where these weapons, where these chemicals are stored and destroyed them. And so it makes you hope that if the Syrians try to do something as elaborate as trying to build a nuclear weapon, there would be probably some kind of intelligence signature that we could pick up. If you make a nuclear weapon, you have to have a source of fissile material, either plutonium or uranium, and those are pretty, you need a lot of equipment, and it's a pretty big signature if you build something like that. So I'm not as worried anymore about the Syrians going with nukes, but I'm just worried about all the actors that are in this mix right now, because Syria has become essentially, name the group and they're there in terms of the bad guys that we know, Al Qaeda affiliate, there's ISIS is still there, all these Iranian-backed militias, there's lots of folks who would like to do something to splash you to make international news. And so it might not be the Syrian government, it could be any of these others.
And kind of related to the ongoing concern about chemical weapons, being used by ISIS or Al Qaeda or any other affiliate. Can you also talk about, unfortunately, the kind of perhaps brewing storm that you cover and other journalists cover, but the fact that there are thousands of ISIS fighters in prisons, often controlled by the Kurds that perhaps don't have the money or the infrastructure to keep them well secured. There was a massive prison break attempt there recently. And can you talk about the threat of a massive prison break from there, or just the more immediate threat of these young 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old boys who've been in refugee camps for years with no education, no outlook, no anything, perhaps being another recruiting ground for extremists?
So yeah, both of these are big challenges. There are, as you said, thousands of former fighters and families of fighters that were essentially rounded up by the Kurds or by the Iraqis, and some of them are from other countries, from Europe. These countries don't want them back, and so they've been warehoused in pretty appalling conditions that are sort of just bad from a humanitarian point of view, but essentially big breeding grounds, as we've seen in the past, for lots of like-minded radical people kind of joining together and kind of sharing ideas and secrets with one another. So that's always a problem. But the other one that you mentioned, I feel is probably even a bigger issue. I've been to some of those refugee camps on the border, and it's almost hard to get your head around the scale of them. Just think of the world's biggest tent city, and you're in the middle of it, it just goes on and on and on. The third biggest city in Jordan, a country of 7 million people, is a refugee camp on their border. There's massive numbers of people. And so the ones that are living in these sort of UN-run refugee camps have some kind of rudimentary opportunities with schooling or whatever. But in sort of other parts of Iraq and Syria, there has been no rebuilding. There are no schools that function. So you've got a generation of young people who've grown up without school, as we would think of it. And with cities that aren't going to be built anytime soon, so they don't have economic opportunities, what are they going to do? They're growing up around a bunch of radicalized older men, opportunities to join one of these groups and make some money and have a gun and be a big shot. Just there are no good role models. These, we saw in Afghanistan a place that was sort of lawless, a failed state where there's lots of unemployed young men. This was the breeding ground where Al Qaeda came from, and for a lot of the problems we're still dealing with from that era. And you just see it happening over again in Syria, because it's just inevitable. We're going to hear from some of these young boys sometime in the future. They're going to do something that's going to call our attention.
And you've been one of the foremost journalists writing on terrorism for many, many years. In the book, you mentioned a plot for 2003 when Al Qaeda potentially was going to use a form of cyanide, hydrogen cyanide, which a lot of people may not have realized, but perhaps was stopped because we invaded Afghanistan. But they're always looking for the next thing. They're always looking for the next way to creatively, sadly, kill as many people as they can. and strike back at the West or regimes in the region. Maybe you could also talk about some of the things that's concerning our military and intelligence figures now. Some of you might see a recent article we had on drones and the threat of drones being used to deliver chemical weapons.
Yeah. So drones are kind of the worrisome new platform because we were looking really smart for a number of years. We were able to use drones, freely in other countries, places we weren't at war, like Pakistan, and take out bad guys, people that we saw as a threat, all by remote control by somebody working at a desk in Iran. It's just phenomenal, advance or change in the way that warfighting is done. That's not a monopoly anymore. The Iranians make multiple models of drones, including one that's kind of essentially a ripoff of our Predator, one of our armed drones. One of those crashed in Iran a few years ago, and they essentially reverse engineered it, and they did a pretty good job of it. So they have their own weaponized drone platforms now. And they've not just using it for themselves, but they've given them to their Houthi allies in Yemen, and they use them in attacks against the Saudis. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen multiple instances of that. They've given it to some of the Shia militia groups that are in Iraq and Syria. So these guys, some of them have their own drone systems, and they use it to attack American bases or to carry out surveillance. So it's a very common technology now. And of course, you can buy the cheap ones, for not much money at all, if you're just looking for something like a hobby drone. But the more expensive ones that are like $3,000-$4,000 that are big enough to carry an explosive, those are obtainable. You can get them on Amazon will deliver to your house. So this is a whole new era. So part of what this sort of the challenge for our forces that are still based there is developing anti-drone systems where they can shoot these things down when they become a nuisance. And that's now it's critical technology because those drones are coming at us. And they're coming after the Russians too, by the way, because the Russians have an air base and a navy base in Syria, and both of them have come under swarm attacks by drones or just fought by some of these opposition groups. So it's sort of seems to be the trendy thing to do at the moment.
And my colleagues, Jack and Shane, if any of you have questions, we have these yellow question cards. Feel free to write a question. We'll get to those in just a minute. Maybe just two more quick questions to get to the audience. You mentioned Russia, going full board to support Assad. Are there potential blowbacks that should the Russians maybe down the line that they're keeping a regime in power, besides the awful reputation for invigorating Sunni fundamentalists and extremist groups to get motivated by? They're keeping a regime in power that's reconstituting chemical weapons that perhaps could be captured by terrorist groups.
Yeah.
And are they concerned that eventually the fundamentalists and extremists in Dagestan, Chechnya, some of their own Muslim group areas could basically end up with chemical weapons because of what's happening in Syria?
That's a good question. One has to remember that one of the reasons, there's a list of them, but one of the reasons that the Russians got involved in Syria to begin with is they do worry about the sort of extremist threat in their own territory. They've got very large Muslim populations in parts of Russia, and certainly in some of the neighboring countries. They fought a war against the Chechens. So there are essentially they do have the potential of a radicalized population within their own borders, and they sort of at least make pretend to care about wanting to repress or suppress this threat elsewhere. But as a result of what they've done in Syria, the Russians are loathed by these groups, by the al-Nusras and the ISIS folks, because they see them as far bigger bad guys than the Americans, because they've done a lot more damage to them in some cases. And so, I think that potential of a blowback is there, and also just they've been tolerant of, since 2014, tolerant of Syria's, possessing of residual amounts of chemical weapons, and some of those could end up back in some of their territories and be used against them.
And lastly, I think I'm just going to turn to your questions. From the audience, for years, you've had incredible access to the highest levels of Republican administrations, Democratic administrations, the highest levels of the military, the intelligence communities, some of the best analysts we have in the United States and elsewhere. There are no easy solutions, but maybe is there a common trend that you've heard from them, or perhaps your own opinion of how the U.S. should approach the issue of Syria and the terrorist threat from there? Should we keep, low levels of special forces and trainers in Iraq? Should we, keep forward air observers nearby if we need them? What do you think is the kind of prevailing wisdom as to what should be done?
Yeah, and that's of course the question that everyone has been wrestling with, and the Biden administration when it came in announced a review of their Syria policy. It's been a year and change now, and we haven't seen that, so they're still grappling with what exactly that's going to look like. So the couple of themes that come out of discussions that you have with people who are looking at this is that having skin in the game is extremely important, and it's pretty cheap. So we have exactly, that's the authorization level anyway, 900 of our soldiers in Syria in a couple locations. And just that small presence, essentially backing the Kurds and helping them with training and helping with intelligence and air power when they need it. It's been decisive in terms of keeping bad things from happening. It keeps the Iranians in check because they don't want to mess with us. And in areas where we have influence and some say so over procedure and operations, ISIS has struggled to come back. They're doing more damage, doing more attacks in Syrian controlled territory than they are in areas where we have forces. So that little investment is paid off. And it's not, unlike, having a big troop deployment with 30,000 soldiers in a place like Iraq, where it gets to be so draining on families. The guys that are there tend to be special forces guys that live and breathe this stuff, and they want to be there, and they care about the local populations, and they speak the language, and they're really impressive, and they believe in the mission. So it's not necessarily a hardship for them either, but it's just a good investment for our government. But I think the more important thing that we're struggling with is to align our essentially be much more practical about what we expect in these parts of the world. Part of our problem in Syria has been sort of over-promising and then under-delivering, saying that Assad must go, but not being willing to sort of make sure that happens. And sort of missing out on opportunities to sort of do things that are helpful, maybe in small ways, instead of throwing a ton of resources at a problem that just isn't solvable. And so I think if nothing else, we have to learn some humility out of this, that we can't solve all the world's problems and we shouldn't try to, but when we can do things relatively inexpensively to make sure that our interests are protected, then that's worth the spending of the time and effort to try to get that happen.
And two good questions related to ISIS. You mentioned drones, sadly only $3,000 or $4,000. Someone asked, how is ISIS funded? What's their source of funding? And then Alan also asked, we discussed the growing ISIS and Islamic threat in Africa.
Okay, two really good questions. So the funding one is really interesting. So the Al-Qaeda model, Al-Qaeda had international funding networks. They had people in countries who would raise money for them because they just believed in the cause, and so they would get essentially donations, like you almost donate to a charity, or even sort of charities linked to some of these groups that would funnel money to them. ISIS is not like that. ISIS, essentially, they were founded by a guy who started his career as a gangster and a thug. And ISIS still has his swagger and his way of doing business. So they raised money by shaking people down, kidnappings, extortion. When they took over, one of the amazing things about taking over territories, you get things like banks with all the currency that they have. So they took over Mosul. They went to the First National Bank of Mosul and just cleared out their vaults. And they ended up with millions and millions and millions of dollars in hard currency. And so they still have stashed away somewhere more money than they could ever spend. One of the interesting things that the Americans did to try to fight back against it, we were able a few times to figure out where they were keeping the cash, and we dropped bombs on those locations. And there's actually video you can see of millions of dollars kind of going up in smoke because we didn't want them to have it. So that's one of the things we do. And the second part of the question was.
And I suppose the role of ISIS in Africa, the Sahel, those sorts of areas.
So as the caliphate was collapsing, the leader, Baghdadi, put out an interesting video. He did not put out many, but one of the last ones that he made was paying tribute to all these little branch sort of chapters of ISIS that had sprung up throughout the world and how well they were doing. He mostly talked about the ones in Africa. What you have in Africa are 3 or 4, depending on So they sort of changed their orientation and sort of crossed lines sometimes. But ISIS chapters that are quite strong enough to knock off military convoys. And in one case, there's a group in Mozambique on the southeastern coast that was able to take over an entire city and they held it for several weeks before they were finally driven out. They've got a lot of firepower. The good news for us is they don't seem to have many sort of overseas ambitions. They sort of, a lot of them kind of emerged out of local fights and they just put the ISIS brand on themselves. But they are considered ISIS. They call themselves ISIS. They're in communication with the mothership, and they are formidable. And there's particularly in the east, as I said, in Nigeria and Niger, there are some really, really strong groups, and we're just beginning as Americans to try to grapple with how important they are in the long term with stability in some of these countries.
An interesting question here from Leslie. She asks, does Assad have a secession plan, a son, a cousin, and will there be a power struggle?
So yeah, first it was Hafez, the father, then there's Bashar, and I think it's Mo Assad is going to be, no, I'm just kidding, but there is a succession plan. He is allowed to be in office until 2028, and then according to, they changed the constitution to let him stay longer, but he's supposed to be out in 2028. But one of his kids, they're already starting to suggest this is going to be the next one. So it's a dynasty. It's kind of this really amazing thing that's emerged. And the thing is that he's not liked. I mean, he wasn't very popular when he became sort of leader of Syria. He wasn't supposed to be the president. It was supposed to be his brother, this kind of charismatic older brother who was dashing, handsome, and this brother ends up getting killed in a car accident. So they yanked young Bashar out of medical school in London. He was studying to be an ophthalmologist because it was said he didn't like the sight of blood, so that it was like this part of the medical profession that he went into. Irony of ironies. And so he wasn't well liked in Syria. He was considered like, oh, this is kind of like the plan B leader. And the Russians don't like it either. They invest a lot of money in keeping him in power because they don't really see an alternative to him. There's really no single figure that they see that could be able to run this country the way the Assad family has. And we kept thinking for years, 2011, 2012, we figured that one of these days, the Russians are going to get sick of this guy, or they're going to give him a nice golden parachute and let him settle in a villa in Petersburg someplace. But it's never happened. And so we're stuck with him. A lot of the Arab countries have now decided that, well, he won, so we're just going to make nice with him and reopen our embassies. But I think unless something crazy happens, maybe because of the Ukraine conflict, we're going to have the Assads to deal with for a very long time. We're never going to accept them. We as Americans, we've essentially decided policy-wise that he's always going to be a pariah. We're never going to have relations with that government. But as a practical measure, a lot of his neighbors are saying, well, this is the new reality. We just got to live with it. So he's there for a while.
I think one of the sickest ironies was, I think last year, wasn't Syria just brought back on and rotating service in the WHO, the World Health Organization?
Yeah. And sometimes on the human rights conditions too, it's always great when that happens.
Pretty awful. Dorothy asked a good question, as regarding northern Syria. What do you see in the future? Will Turkey move further south? Will the Assad regime allow the Kurds to maintain control? What do you see in northern Syria and maybe more broadly with regards to the Kurds?
Yeah. So just for folks who don't follow this as closely, it's a good question. So in the northwestern part of Syria, it's this weird little enclave, one city called Idlib, which remains in rebel hands. And it does so because the Turks essentially decided this is going to be our little fiefdom, kind of a buffer zone for us. And so they have several divisions deployed along the border, and they support their own proxy armies that run this part of Syria. The pedigree of these groups is a bit disturbing. They're essentially all affiliated with what was once called Al-Nusra Front, and Al-Nusra Front was officially declared allegiance to Al-Qaeda. So these are not good guys, and they have essentially run this part of Syria as a caliphate. It's under Islamic Sharia law, and it's kind of a frozen conflict at this point. The Assad's not launching any offensives to try to go after these people. They probably aren't going to do it now. The Russians are preoccupied. And so this is almost a de facto partition of the country with a big chunk of Syrian real estate being in the hands of a rebel group without a government, without any kind of law and order or school districts or anything. It's just essentially this little crazy enclave that exists. And it's kind of the same in the northeast, where the Kurds essentially have an autonomous region that they control, but they're not going to be allowed to be autonomous really, because the Turks are too concerned about that. So just these strange little enclaves that exist in this country, and covering a lot of territory. I just was shocked to read the other day that only about 12% of the international border crossings around Syria are actually controlled by the Syrians. The rest are controlled by the Turks or by some of these opposition groups or some of the Kurds. And so there's so much of their country they don't even manage, including about a third of their population is living in areas outside their government control. So it's a very, very strange place, and yet weirdly kind of frozen in time. It's been described recently, and I think accurately, as the probably one or two or three top most, the most important unresolved conflicts in the world, because it's kind of frozen in place in a very bad place, and sooner or later some awful things are going to happen, emanating out of this failed state, and we're very going to clean up the mess.
The two good questions to kind of conclude everything with. Ricardo asks, what has been the discussion given the adversarial advantages of asymmetrical warfare, particularly the economics of groups who do not follow rules of engagement or require logistics?
Well, that's a good question. So there's two different kinds of asymmetric warfare, but I think the one that's referred to here is countries that completely ignore norms and international laws, including chemical weapons treaty. And sort of a big violator, as it turns out, is the Russians, who, like us during the Cold War, they had a massive stockpile of chemical weapons. We did too. We declared it, we sort of outlawed them in the 1990s. Both America and Russia agreed to get rid of their entire stockpiles. We spent something like $20 billion over the last 2 decades to get rid of ours. We're still not done. That's how hard it is to get rid of them. The Russians did the same. But the Russians ended up keeping some of their stuff to use for various dirty tricks to kill people they don't like. Famously, as you guys will probably all remember, in 2017, they decided to try to assassinate a Russian spy who was living in England. So they sent 2 agents into Salisbury, England, just down the road from Stonehenge, to assassinate the man and his daughter using this really powerful nerve agent called Novichok. And the vial of Novichok was recovered later, and one of the most fascinating details about that little vial, so this real tiny perfume sample vial, it contained the dose equivalent of 10,000 deaths. There was enough poison in that one little vial to, in theory, kill 10,000 people. So they've got a residual amount of this, at least, that they've either kept or maintained or made new stuff, and they feel absolutely empowered to ignore whatever rules and standards, including things they've agreed with, to use it as they see fit, and then just lie about it. There's an interesting phenomenon with it's kind of a Soviet era thing, but it's if you lie and you lie in such a bald-faced way that everybody knows you're lying, but you just say it louder, there's something that's macho about that. It's something that it's something that's valued and seen as impressive. So you just say, well, that wasn't us doing that. It could have been us. It was obviously the British doing some false flag thing. And so they just completely make up stories, and their followers and acolytes and bots on Twitter just repeat the lie again and again and again. And folks either trust their version, or they just see one side and they see the other side. They just think that it's just unresolved and nobody will ever know what really happened, and they just kind of forget about it. But they end up winning that way because they just confuse everything.
And I'd also just like to kind of recognize the courage of one of your colleagues who writes for the Washington Post. At least a number of you were here or saw him online 2 weeks ago when we hosted Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian opposition figure who was a right-hand man of Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated, shot dead outside Kremlin. Works closely with Alexei Navalny, who was poisoned, and Vladimir Kara-Murza himself has been poisoned twice, both times in the hospital in a coma for over a week. The doctors didn't expect him to live. So it's an ongoing and dire threat of ongoing use of horrific weapons. And again, just I'd really like to respect and admire those brave Russians like your colleague Kara Mirza, like Navalny, like Netsov, who was killed, who take the time to speak out knowing that they're facing death.
I just want to point out that if I can
Sure.
just butt in, it's a bit comforting, I think, that they always manage to screw it up somehow. And just with the assassination attempt in Salisbury, England, there were all these, British have the security cameras everywhere. So they saw the two, lunkheads who came in to do the act. They were able to recover the chemical afterwards, and they didn't succeed. They didn't manage to get enough of the chemical on the guy to kill him. They just killed two innocent, an innocent bystander later. And so they always get caught in these things. Or even with Navalny, they didn't manage to kill him, even though they came very close. And they allowed him to leave the country and go to Germany, where he was able to be tested and the poison was found and identified. So that either suggests they're kind of bungling in what they do, or maybe they just don't care. Maybe it's just sort of a thing, we're sending a message and we don't really care if we succeed or not, we're just making a point, and they do it in a very deadly way.
Yeah, and a last question, puts up everything we've discussed in one very easy question for you, just joking, but someone asks, with all of the history, the Islamic groups, Assad's regime, the rebels, the Kurds, what will or should the U.S. do with regards to Syria?
Well, so folks at State Department love to say that Syria is the problem from hell. And I think we've seen that since the very beginning. There are no easy solutions for any of these things. I think one thing that we do have to do, that's just as a moral issue, from my point of view, is to back the people who are working with us so diligently. I mostly mean the Kurds here. We defeated ISIS in Iraq, well, mostly in Syria, but also in Iraq as well, because we had the Kurdish allies who fought on the ground, who went into Raqqa and liberated that city, block by block, street by street. With our backing in terms of our military equipment, our airplanes and missile strikes, but they did the hard fighting. And now they're vulnerable. They're worried that, any day if we decide to cozy up Turkey on something, we're going to turn our backs on them and essentially turn them over to the Turks. And it feels to me that just as not just as a moral issue, but as a way to to guarantee good alliances in the future, you need to reward your friends and be with your friends and support them, and especially when they are risking their very lives to help us. And so, at the very least, we've got to figure out who the good guys are and do what we can to help them succeed.
Yeah, and again, I want to congratulate you on Redline. For any of you, I highly recommend Triple Agent. Obviously, you won the Pulitzer Prize for Black Flags and Redline. I know you're all going to enjoy it. And I'm volunteering in Joby for any of you who want to get it signed afterwards. Please feel free to stay around and get signed. And we're having a bit of a reception afterwards. Any of you want to have a chat and get a bit of wine. But I just want to thank you sincerely for your years of dedication to journalism and kind of helping the American and really the international community understand the depth and the dire nature of some of these issues that you deal with. And I know it can't be easy dealing with such horrific crimes, such horrific organizations. But thank you for, in a lot of ways, your journalistic service to the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Really